All right, let's go ahead and get started. Hello, everyone, again, and welcome to the webinar, 7 Myths Debunked, Leveraging Criminal Data to Mitigate Business Risk. Just a couple of housekeeping items before we get started. This webinar is being recorded and will be sent to all your emails. So we encourage you to ask any questions that you might have throughout the session using the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom screen. My name is Wendy Liu. I lead product marketing for Checker Trust. And joining me today is Chris Stagg, our Senior Customer Success Manager. Chris, do you want to hop on and introduce yourself?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Wendy. Hello, everybody. My name is Chris Stagg. I lead customer success for Checker Trust. Work really closely with all of our customers to help them achieve their trust, safety, and risk mitigation goals using our criminal data integrations.
Awesome, amazing. And I'm so excited you're here and doing this webinar with me, Chris. In today's webinar, we will be talking about some of the common myths of leveraging criminal data. Now, criminal data is often associated with things like employment background checks or tenant screening, but its potential actually extends far beyond that. In sectors like online marketplaces, vehicle rental, sharing economy, visitor management systems, and so on and so forth, criminal data can actually be a very powerful tool for mitigating business risks, whether they're financial risks, physical harm, even brand reputational risks as well. However, we know that there are obviously a lot of misconceptions about its accessibility and utility and its utility. And that's really prevented a lot of businesses from leveraging these valuable risk signals. So in today's webinar, we're going to unpack some of these common myths so that you can gain a better understanding of what criminal data is and how you can use it. And Chris will also be jumping in to share some insights from our customers and their experience. And take a quick pause here. Sorry about that. So for those who are unfamiliar with Checker Trust, we are an affiliated company of Checker, which is one of the largest employment background check providers in the country. Checker Trust provides risk intelligence for non-employment use cases, and we're built on industry-leading criminal identity and driver data. We know that risk looks very different if you are a caregiving marketplace compared to a financial institution or a vehicle rental marketplace or an online dating platform. So we really give you the data and the tools to identify the risks that matter to your business and in a way that you can automatically leverage the data in your workflows to make them in a more scalable and cost-effective way. Today, Checker Trust powers over 10 million screens per month across online marketplaces, physical security solutions, and other businesses, helping them protect their customers, drive more revenue, and scale with confidence. So before we dive into our myths, we are going to put up a quick poll to just get a gauge of whether or not you are currently using your criminal data today. And no, you will not be tested on this. This is just for our information and would love to know whether or not you're leveraging it today. So let's dive right in and address our first myth. Criminal data can't be used for risk mitigation. Now, I'm going to preface this by saying, with a huge disclaimer, I'm not a lawyer. This is not legal advice. This is educational purposes only. And we highly recommend consulting your legal counsel or reaching out to us if you want to discuss your use case in greater detail. But with that said, we often get the question, like, are we even allowed to use criminal data? And the short answer is yes, but it depends on how the data will be used. There are some specific use cases, such as employment or tenancy or underwriting. And these use cases have very strict guidelines and regulations for how the criminal data is used. And you would typically work with a consumer reporting agency to obtain the background checks for these protected use cases or regulated use cases. For the purposes of this webinar, we're really focusing on unregulated use cases, such as screening users on your platform or screening your customers before they're onboarded or before they're given access to specific services, or to make decisions to help you reduce any financial or physical harm or risk. Now, in the US, criminal data is publicly available information. So technically, you could access the criminal records of any individual. And we'll talk a little bit about why this is not as easy as it sounds in our next few myths. But to go back to this myth, yes, you can use criminal data. It is publicly available information. Now, our customers are using criminal data oftentimes as a risk signal to really help them define their risk mitigation strategies. So, for example, you can create business logic that individuals who have some high risk profiles undergo additional screenings or continued monitoring. Chris, can you share some insights on how some of our customers are using criminal data today?
Yeah, definitely. So, yeah, as Wendy mentioned, our customers are often looking at criminal data as a risk signal, right? So, one customer, that we work with is a healthcare center. They provide mental health, addiction recovery, primary care, and other health-related services. There's somebody who partners with Check Our Trust to screen patients against the sex offender registries and for violent offenses. So they want to flag patients with these types of risks, and they don't withhold care. But what they want to do is ensure that these patients are treated in like a dedicated wing with trained staff to avoid incidents such as harm to other patients or caregivers. So kind of a different way to approach risk signals than those traditional kind of permissible purpose use cases. Really good use case in the last 3 months. They've run over like 30,000 screens and they've reduced their total recordable incident rate by like 34%. So pretty awesome.
Yeah, that's a great example of really how they're using data to inform their policies as opposed to restricting certain services. So thank you for sharing. Thank you for sharing. Let's go on to myth number two. Criminal data is standardized across all municipal and state levels. Now, this is probably the most surprising thing that I've learned once joining Checker Trust. There's actually no such thing as a national criminal database that the government maintains, government in quotes. In fact, every state and every municipal level catalogs and codes their criminal charges differently. Now, what this means is that the same type of charge in California could be completely different and completely different code in Oklahoma or in Nebraska. And that makes it very difficult to leverage criminal data because you don't know if you're looking at the same type of code or the same type of charge or the same severity. Now, the good news is that Checker Trust has actually built out a proprietary database that pulls records from over 2,400 sources of state records, as well as security watch lists, registries, so on and so forth. And we've built out proprietary classifications and mapped the charges to really create some level of standardization. And that makes it really easy for you to use this data at scale regardless of where your users or where your customers are coming from. Chris, can you maybe share an example of how this really impacts our customers?
Yeah, for sure. And this is like one of my favorite myths and maybe like one of the most common ones that we hear, I think. Yeah, so one of our customers we work with is a childcare community marketplace that connect community caregivers to families, and they have a national presence. So trust and safety is super important to their business. There's children involved, but they also want to make sure that families, caregivers, community members, all feel safe in their online and offline communities. So previously, this use case, they would search a sex offender registry, which is a really specific type of record, really important record, but it wouldn't pull anyone who has violent charges or, maybe offenses against minors, both of which are super important to their business. So this customer was concerned about, operational effort it would take to manually vet their members, but also felt, the responsibility of ensuring their safe platform for families leveraging their services. So um, they began using Checker Trust. We help them to, again, identify these categories, these subcategories of crimes that are relevant to their specific business. Again, things like sexual abuse, lewd behavior, abduction. What are some other ones I have listed here? Restraint, assault and battery, custody charges, warrants, arrest, etc. And because they serve multiple states, it was super important to be able to standardize these filters across all those states. So, with Checker Trust, we've helped them flag over 100 additional like risk signals beyond the sex offender registries nationwide. Um, So they integrate with Checker Trust via the API. They're able to automate these, screening workflows, help to increase onboarding by 35%. And they have been able to reduce manual reviews by 80%. So super impressive numbers. Because they were able to onboard folks faster, they also saw growth in their business. They grew about, I think, 15% year over year. So really unlocking a lot of like additional growth and revenue opportunities.
That's amazing. And I think you hit on a really important note there around standardization and making sure that all your users, regardless of what state they reside in or what state they had some type of record, that everyone is kind of held to the same policies. So it's great to hear that Checker Trust was able to really help them flag all those similar risks, regardless of the state, and really help them unlock some of those additional signals, especially if you're dealing with vulnerable populations. I think, some of the more publicly available, like sex offender registries, sometimes just don't do enough to really catch all those risks. Mm. So let's go on to myth number 3. Criminal charges are too difficult to understand. This is something that we hear quite often from our customers before they start working with us. And to be fair, sometimes they can be incredibly difficult to understand. Each state has thousands of criminal charges, and sorting through each of those different charges to figure out what's relevant and figuring out the severity of those charges, that's a full-time job in and of itself. However, we've actually made pretty significant advancements to help filter and group charges and really help you narrow down what's really relevant to your business. So you're not having to sort through every single penal code, but you're able to narrow it down to, whether it's theft and property or whether it's vehicle and traffic, you can really narrow it down by those categories and subcategories. And we've actually built our own proprietary classification to make that really easy for our customers during, when they're setting up their integration. And you can help, automate your workflows based on whether your users or your customers are passing that screening criteria. So, Chris, what's been your experience in helping our customers understand the different charges and setting up their accounts?
Yeah, so when setting up our customers' accounts, I work super closely with them to really understand like what they care about, what are their goals, and what risk signals are most important, right? We want to understand, um, while every business defines like risk differently, and will have different risk tolerances. And so, although we provide access to all the data, again, we want to work with our customers to set up custom filters for crimes and severities that are relevant to their specific business. So the slide that you see here, just kind of a quick comparison of what those might look like. So comparing a home sharing marketplace to an online dating platform. In home sharing or short-term rental businesses, you're likely concerned about making sure your property isn't damaged, right? Or that the guests or hosts don't have, active warrants or present risk of using the property for nefarious purposes like, drug trafficking or human trafficking, things like that. In an online dating platform scenario, there's kind of different risks to think about, right? There's an inherent risk that a bad actor might go on a date and cause physical harm to somebody or sexual harm, right? And they can have, obviously lasting like operational and brand damage to the platform. So a lot of customers have chosen to do kind of a one, two, three approach to screening users. So users who maybe don't have any criminal or public records are passed through, given access to the platform. Users who have, recent and severe felony or criminal charges, relating to, say, violence, sexual crimes, fraud and deception, etc. Those folks might be banned from using the services. And then in the middle, you might have folks with lesser charges or misdemeanors who maybe are treated a little bit different. Maybe they're flagged and monitored. So that kind of one, two, three step approach helps to, again, like identify where your risk tolerance lies and how you want to action on those different cohorts. So the flexibility, I think, really matters. And again, we really help our customers to easily identify the charges that are relevant to their specific business.
Um, And I think that also just highlights that there are some weird laws as well that, it just helps you really cut through the noise. I think I've seen some very interesting state laws, like you can't walk around with an ice cream cone in your pocket, or things like fishing without a license, which valid, but at the same time, probably not something that you care deeply about as it relates to the risk that that might present to your specific business. So I love that we're able to really show like the flexibility and customization depending on what your actual business is looking for. So let's move on to myth number 4. Using criminal data is expensive. Now, traditional background checks can be quite expensive. So again, if we were talking about some of those regulated use cases where they're making a hiring decision or a tenant decision or underwriting decision, depending on really the granularity and how extensive those reports are, background checks can range from $20 to $150 per report. Now, especially if you're an online platform or community or any business where your margins are extremely small, this obviously isn't scalable, especially if you're trying to screen all of your customers or all of your users. This is why it's extremely important to know where your data provider is getting their data from and whether or not they have direct access to that criminal data. If they're often purchasing from a reseller, they would end up passing those fees through to you. So that can obviously rack up your prices as well. With Checker Trust, we've built a lot of those direct source integrations and direct access points. So we're actually able to provide checks that are often less than $2 per screen. Obviously, that depends on what kind of screens you're doing or how much volume you're checking. But obviously, compared to a background check, it can be extremely cost effective, and you can really be able to leverage these costs at scale. So, Chris, can you maybe share some other ways where using criminal data can be more cost effective or actually end up driving cost savings or revenue?
Yeah, for sure. And I think you brought up good points already. Just the simple terms of like the cost of a regulated check versus a non-regulated check. There's a huge difference there. But one great example that I think we we see how our customers can use this for cost savings is running an initial criminal screen before executing a more costly check, kind of a pre-screen. So, for example, like one of our customers is a surrogacy center. As you see on the slide here. And they connect surrogates with families, right? So they used to run background checks on every surrogate and every family member. And what they found was like nearly 40% of their candidates were being flagged or failing background checks. So, we think that conducting an extensive background check for surrogates and intended parents is super appropriate and important. But we also think that there could be an opportunity for significant cost savings, specifically for this customer by screening out individuals we know would not pass a more thorough background check. So a lot of customers think about this as like a waterfall approach. So basically, they run kind of a pre-screen to make sure their potential surrogates are cleared to continue through the process, right? And then if selected later in the process, they can run that more extensive, comprehensive background check. But by implementing this waterfall strategy, family care teams were able to like focus on the qualified surrogates and families without having those high costs up front, and they've seen a reduction in their cost of background checks by like 60%.
Yeah, I think it's really common even also in financial institution use cases as well, where they'll often do kind of a lighter weight screening upfront, and then before some type of high risk transaction, they'll kind of do a separate type of screen or a separate type of identity verification to help help mitigate additional risks during a different point in different trigger points. So that also kind of shows the flexibility of you don't always have to do these screens top of funnel. You don't always have to do these, across your entire user base. You can kind of pick and choose when it makes sense. And we can obviously partner with you to figure out what that design that solution together. So let's move on to our myth number 5, criminal data is slow. A traditional background check can take anywhere from a few hours to a few days, depending on, again, on how extensive that search is. And in an employment or a tenant scenario, this turnaround day time can be more acceptable. But when you're talking about onboarding new users or facilitating some type of online transaction, your users are really expecting a fast, easy, seamless experience. So you can't really have those several hour lag times, especially not in these use cases. Checker Trust has built out, again, our own database. And so we can often provide our customers with results in under 1 second. I believe the turnaround time is about 0.5 seconds. And Chris, I think you have a great example of why this speed is so important to our customers. So I'll let you take it away.
Yeah, speed is like we say often a critical factor for many of our customers. It's like always an important factor, right? Regardless of your industry, like speed and cost are the two things we hear a lot of, right? So speed's super important. Like the use case that comes to mind here that we have on the slide, visitor management systems. They can't afford to have people, in a lobby backed up full of people, right? So you need to be able to access information really fast, right? Instant information so that you can process your guests, quickly, efficiently. And at the same time, you need to make sure that the quality of the data is strong, right? As you're screening visitors who are entering schools, with children or secure facilities with sensitive materials. So um, one customer we have in the VMS space, Verkada, they're one of the leading providers of physical security solutions. Thousands of schools across the country use Verkada to manage their visitors. And Checker Trust integrates directly with their visitor management system, VMS system. So the receptionists are able to really quickly see if there are any risks with giving a visitor access, to their building. Really strong use case in 2024. They ran over 3.7 million searches, identified 3,800 sexual offenders who were restricted from school properties. The criminal and public records. Again, like Wendy said, the return is super fast. 0.5 seconds is our metric there. And again, just allows receptionists to really quickly allow permitted individuals in and take additional security measures on those folks who should not be on premise.
Yeah, I think there are, especially in the visitor management space, you'll have more compliance requirements as well to make sure that you're tracking individuals. But also, in the case of schools, oftentimes we see that there is a requirement to flag to, uh, law enforcement if there are any sex offenders or certain types of records that are coming to your schools. So it's also a pretty big compliance component. And I actually remember pretty recently I was visiting a building and they had me actually fill out a visitor management form 24 hours before going to their building. And obviously they were not using Checker Trust, but I was thinking to myself, this is kind of silly that I have to fill out this whole, intakes form a full day or even multiple days before actually coming on onto their premise. Um, so maybe just something to consider, especially as you think about marketplaces. And again, that kind of the Amazon experience that a lot of customers expect and consumers expect. They want that fast, seamless experience. All right, we are getting close. We are on myth number 6. Criminal data is unreliable. Now, I will be incredibly transparent. Criminal data can sometimes be unreliable. Criminal data is incredibly messy. And the number of times that criminal records have typos or have gaps in information is more likely and more often than you'd like to think, unfortunately. But the two most important things to consider here are, one, does your data provider have direct access points or to these data points, or are they relying on static lists? And two, do you have a multi-layered approach to make sure that you're identifying the right person and reducing blind spots? So when we think about criminal data or criminal intelligence, the reality is that there will always be pros and cons and gaps in each data set or solution. And that's why we like to think of data in a Swiss cheese model, where multiple layers help you address different gaps to help you provide a more comprehensive coverage. And to effectively reduce risk on your platform, you kind of have to layer in additional risk signals to assess the individual before letting them engage onto your platform. So, for example, if you are an organization that serves vulnerable populations like minors, you should ensure that your user doesn't have any crimes against minors in their history. or if there is an in-person interaction, you'd want to know if the user presents a risk of physical harm based on their convictions or warrants. I think especially if you think about your platform and what information you collect from your users, oftentimes you're collecting very limited PII, and you want to make sure that your data provider is able to take that information and either enrich it so that you can make sure that you are working towards identifying the right person and then being able to pull the relevant records appended to that PII. So, Chris, can you maybe share an example of how different risk signals can come together to provide a more comprehensive coverage?
Yeah, for sure. I'd say, order extra cheese. You got to get extra cheese always, right? No, yeah. So like Wendy mentioned, there's not like a silver bullet to prevent, 100% of risks or safety concerns. So we have customers in the vehicle rental business, in pretty common use cases in recent years, they've experienced increases in fraud, property damage, theft, which is, one of the most significant impacts on operations and on margins. So previously, a customer in particular was using a solution that pulled motor vehicle reports, MVRs, and while MVRs pull really relevant driver history, things like crashes, suspensions, etc. They can be super expensive, right, due to pass-through fees, and they can also miss relevant criminal risk signals. So we have implemented this multi-layer approach to help like address some of those problems and fill some of those holes, right? So first, they will run a kind of light lift, low cost identity check to first of all make sure the person that they're renting a vehicle to is in fact the real person they're talking to, right? Ensures that they aren't using a fake identity to rent their vehicles. Then they will run a driver check to make sure the individual has a valid license to rent and drive the vehicle, right? This is a super low cost check to say, hey, before we run, an expensive search on you, let's first make sure that you are eligible to get behind the wheel of a car. And this helps to kind of weed out some of those folks before that high cost search. And then the last piece is we'll run a criminal check to, again, make sure they don't have any relevant risks like grand theft auto, DUIs, reckless driving, maybe like gang affiliations, failure to pay, credit card fraud, etc. And so by layering these different screens, we've been able to really significantly help reduce their fraud incidents by like nearly 35%. We've reduced theft by 30% and seen savings of roughly 300,000 in the first year. So that's a really strong use case.
Yeah. And we actually just ran a data study earlier this week and found that, one of our customers, they're running driver's license status checks, which is the product that Chris was mentioning earlier, where they're just validating whether or not this individual, has a valid license to rent and drive the vehicle. And we found that in our data, 1 in 20 drivers actually did not have a valid license to even rent a car. So there's a huge risk, not only just from a property damage and asset damage perspective, but also from a compliance perspective, in making sure that you're not liable for renting that asset to an individual who's not supposed to be driving it. So kind of interesting data that we were recently able to pull, and love that we were also able to drive that amount of savings to as well. Like, we know that motor vehicle reports can be incredibly expensive. And again, just kind of layering on all those different data aspects across identity, criminal, so on and so forth. It's great that we are able to really look at their risks holistically. All right, we are at myth 7, our last one. I already screened for a global watch list and I have some type of know your customer program. I don't need to use criminal data. More broadly, this is a myth for those who have some type of customer identification or some other compliance requirement. Now, Checker Trust does also have global security watch lists, such as OFAC or PP lists in our public record screenings. However, these watch lists can be incredibly broad and sometimes irrelevant to your business. So, for example, the US Sentencing Commission states that 52% of fraud offenders have a prior conviction. Simply running a KYC or global watch list screening wouldn't flag these individuals. In fact, most KYC providers are really still playing catch up to the risks that AI is also presenting in fraud. Generative AI has played a massive role in increasing the frequency, the severity, and quite frankly, the quality of fraud tactics. In fact, Deloitte predicts that generative AI driven fraud losses in the US could exceed $40 billion by 2027. With deepfakes, synthetic identities, digital document fraud, scams are just becoming harder and harder to detect. This makes it that much more important to really have that multi-layered approach that we spoke about earlier. Chris, can you maybe share some additional insights on how maybe sometimes KYC is insufficient as a risk mitigation strategy?
Yeah. Yeah. So one of our customers is online financial platform for trading cryptocurrency, right? And crypto exchanges are notorious for fraudulent transactions, as they're like often untraceable. And although we have KYC processes in place that include, an identity check and global watch list screenings, they still found, their users were experiencing fraud and account takeovers, which impacts like the overall safety and trustworthiness of the platform. So, as part of our partnership, we ran criminal screens and leveraged our extensive criminal database to ensure their users don't have any relevant risks like terrorism, fraud, deception, bribery, corruption. Um, and what am I missing? I just want to say identity theft and impersonation. So, this is all automated, so they're able to onboard the users, quickly, seamlessly. And then prior to high value transactions, they can leverage our biometric verification as like an added layer of security. So this essentially matches a photo of their driver's license, passport, their ID with a selfie to make sure their information matches and matches all the information in the user's profile. And again, strong use case. We've been able to help reduce fraud incidents by 32% just in the first 3 months.
That's Thank you for sharing, Chris. We've definitely seen fraud pick up across all of our customers in all industries, not just financial institutions. So again, it's about using those additional risk signals beyond customer identification or beyond global watch lists to really use that as more of a strategic element to include in your risk mitigation strategies. So we're going to head into the Q&A segment shortly. So if you do have any questions, please drop them in the Zoom Q&A and we will get those questions going. But as those questions roll in, I will quickly summarize some of the key takeaways from today's webinar. So number one, criminal data can significantly enhance your risk assessment and decision making. Hopefully you can also see throughout all of our examples, they're really applicable across multiple industries and multiple use cases. And as long as your data provider, your data partner is providing that data in a flexible and customizable way, you can really use it as a strong way to enhance your risk mitigation strategies across your entire business. Number two, all businesses define risk differently, so it's important to have a criminal data provider. I actually just rolled that into my first one. So, again, we're talking about that flexibility, how risk looks different across all industries, and making sure that you're able to cut through some of the noise and being able to focus on the charges and the risk signals that matter to you. Number three is the that multi-layered risk solutions can effectively lower your costs and provide coverage of blind spots within each solution. So again, thinking of that, Swiss cheese approach, being able to cover different blind spots and gaps in certain solutions, and being able to layer on whether a sex offender registry, your criminal charges, arrests information, warrant information, so on and so forth, and really be able to have more of a holistic view of the individuals that are engaging with your service. And number four, innovative companies are leveraging criminal data today to reduce risk and harm while keeping the user experience frictionless. These are not, on opposite sides of the table in terms of risk mitigation and customer experience. Is a world where you can have both. And innovative companies are really using this today and able to, as Chris had shared through multiple examples, reduce their risk, reduce fraud, um, drive additional revenue opportunities as well, and ultimately just creating a safer platform for your customers to engage with, and safer business for your customers to engage with as well. And with that, we have some Q&A questions that have rolled through. So, Chris, I'm going to do some rapid fire for you,
Right?
if you don't mind. And looks like, actually, before we're going to hit our demo, our Q&A, we are also going to launch a poll. If you are interested in learning more about leveraging criminal data or any of our risk mitigation solutions, we'd love to connect with you. So please go ahead and submit your poll information. And with that, we will go into Q&A. The first question I have for you, Chris, is how can I determine which criminal charges are relevant to my business?
Yeah, great question. So I'd say look at your own data, right? Look at what's happening in your business, what keeps you up at night, where do you see the risk signals and incidents, and then how can you use that information to back into criminal risk signals? Yeah, for Checker Trust customers, yeah, we partner pretty closely to review all the different categories, subcategories of charges in kind of a filter document, and again, really then closely monitor the impact of the screening and your goals and continue to iterate.
Definitely. Number two, another question here. Do I need to get my users' consent to run screenings?
Yeah, good question. It depends. So for identity and criminal screenings, typically you are not required to, right? Again, this is different from your traditional kind of permissible purpose use cases like employment. And things like that. We typically recommend this is something that's included in a term of, your terms of service for transparency, for driver checks. User consent is typically required by the state DMVs, by and large in the non-regulated space. Again, typically not required, but again, use those terms of service to have a transparent policy.
Yeah, and I think Chris, you had mentioned this in your answer as well, but that is like a big differentiator between kind of like the unregulated use cases versus the regulated use cases. This also a big differentiator for this is in your regulated use cases like employment or in tenant screening or underwriting. You usually also need to provide additional information like your social security number, date of birth, and depending on what kind of platform you are, you might not collect all that information. So that's a big kind of differentiator in terms of the type of information that you're collecting as well. Another question here. What are the best practices for using criminal data to enhance trust and safety?
Yeah, lots of best practices, I think. I think start by talking to your team and make sure you understand how you plan to use the data, know how that might impact your business. We typically see this involve conversations with, legal teams, risk product teams, trust and safety, fraud teams. Definitely something we can also help navigate, we can help navigate these conversations, but definitely like getting that internal alignment is like critical. Um, I'd also say it's important to monitor like the impact and again iterate on your filters based on results you see so that the results are data-centric decisions.
Yeah, absolutely. I actually have a question here also. If rejecting an applicant for employment based on background, do you provide an adverse letter to the applicant? So this is, I just wanted to make clear, Checker Trust does not do background checks for employment. We are not a consumer reporting agency. So we do not provide any background checks for employment or tenant screening purposes. That is more of a products that our parent, our affiliate company Checker, they more focus on employment than us, but they also do in that scenario they do provide an adverse letter to the applicant if they are rejected. So just want to make that clear that Checker Trust is not employment. We are for the unregulated use cases. Another question here for you, Chris. Do you only integrate via API?
Nope, we have API integrations. We also have dashboard access, where you can run individual searches or run like bulk upload searches on several people at a time.
Yeah. And a lot of our customers sometimes use both. They'll use our API integration to do more screening as their users are going through whatever flows or workflows. But they'll also use the dashboard if they want to go back and look up a specific individual, or if they are, doing a specific data study. Um, I think the last question that we have here is, I don't understand the difference between a screening and a background check. Aren't they the same thing? This is a great question. So there are protected use cases of background checks like employment, tenancy, credit, and insurance and underwriting. Again, this is not the type of background check that Checker Trust does. And these background checks are used more for extensive. They're much more extensive. They'll do something like a county level search. They'll do more detailed searches. Subsequently, they are more expensive in the $20 plus range. They are significantly slower, closer to 24 hours. In comparison, Checker Trust, again, non-employment, we provide national criminal searches instantly, and they're typically under $2 per search. So, and obviously that depends on the volume of searches, but those are some of the key differentiators. And we mentioned consent as well. No consent required for unregulated use cases, consent required for those protected use cases. All right, I think that answered all the questions. If you do have additional questions, please feel free to reach out to us. Um, my email is not on the screen, but I will we'll send a follow-up email. So if you have any questions, feel free to follow up with that. And thank you everybody again for joining us on today's webinar. Thank you, Chris, for joining us and sharing all your experience and our stories of our customers. Really appreciate bringing our kind of use cases to light. And that will be it. Thank you so much for joining us. Have a great day.
Thanks, everyone.